Wow, so our last class of Bible school. It's kind of sad, isn't it? We've had quite a journey, I think, through the Judges and understanding the things that are happening in the book of Judges. Really, we're only looking at our second judge today, looking at Gideon. But there's a lot of interesting information that we run into with Gideon. And Gideon's topic is quite a bit larger than some of the other judges. And so we're only going to be touching on parts of that today. First few classes, we looked at how to deal with the Canaanites. And then yesterday we looked at how we should react when someone calls us to the work of fighting against the Canaanites, what our response should be. But what happens when there is nobody that's responding? What happens when you know that something needs to be done, but you're really afraid to do something about it? When you think, well, maybe someone else can do this, someone else will do this, someone else should do this, and I'm not capable and I'm not the guy or the girl to do this work. Well, Gideon gives us a really good look at what it takes to get ourselves going in the work. And Gideon has something that makes him the perfect person to begin the work to fight against the Midianites in this case. We're going to be looking at that this morning. And what he has is fear. He has fear. When we look at Gideon and Judges chapter 6, Judges chapter 7, and we find fear throughout these two chapters. Judges chapter 1 begins with the normal cycle of the judges. It says, "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of Yahweh, and Yahweh delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years." So the same things that we've seen, the same pattern that we expect to find here, is they sin and Yahweh delivers them into the hand of the Midianites to show them what the Canaanite lifestyle brings and to help them to recognize what they need to do to change and to recognize that they actually do need to change. Verse 2, "And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them dens which are in the mountains and caves and strongholds." What that's telling us is that it was really, really, really bad this time. They were living in caves, not in their houses anymore. They'd been forced out of their houses, and they were living in caves. And verse 3 says, "And so it was that when Israel had sown, that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites, and the children of the east, even they came up against them. And they would come up against them when it was harvest time, just after you'd planted and your crops had grown and everything was ready to go. And the Midianites and the Amalekites would come up and take all of your harvest. And the people were devastated because of this." It says, verse 4, "And they encamped against them, destroyed the increase of the earth, till thou come unto Gaza, and left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor ass." So not only did they destroy their crops, but they took all of their animals. They came, verse 5 says, "up with their cattle and their tents. They came as grasshoppers for multitude, for both they and their camels were without number. And they entered into the land to destroy it. And Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites." There were just so many of them. There was nothing that Israel could do about it. It would be like the Great Depression happening at the same time as a war in the country. Things were that desperate in the land of Israel. And the people were starting to think differently than they used to think about God. And there was a real problem with what their thinking was. Verse 7 says, "And it came to pass when the children of Israel cried unto Yahweh because of the Midianites." So they cried out unto God, and there would only have been a few that would have cried out unto God, that would have prayed to God for deliverance, because there was something else that was going on. But when those people cried out to God, it says, Yahweh sent a prophet unto the children of Israel. Now that's unusual, that he sends a prophet. We read yesterday about Deborah being a prophet. But this prophet comes, and this prophet has a message for them that's going to be very important for them recognizing where they're at and where they need to go. And he says unto them, "Thus saith Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, brought you forth out of the house of bondage. And I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of all that oppressed you, and drave them from before you, and gave you their land. I did all these things, God says. I did all these things for you. And verse 10, I said to you, I am Yahweh your God. Fear not the gods of the Amorites, in whose land ye dwell, but ye have not obeyed my voice. And that was God's complaint. That was God's complaint. I've done all these things for you, he says, and you fear the gods of the Amorites. Now, it's unusual, I think, when you read that, because you could read right past it and not catch the gist of what he's saying there. You can read right past it and just think, okay, they failed to drive out the Canaanites again. But there's something more this time. There's something different about it this time when we read through it. What does it mean? He says, the problem is that you fear the gods of the Amorites. Well, there's an echo here. There's an echo to the words of Joshua. Let's go back to Joshua chapter 24. What's he getting at? Why is there a prophet this time that comes and educates the people? And there's going to be an angel that comes next. But why is all of this necessary? Why not just send the judge? And of course, the preparation of Gideon is part of that. But there's an underlying message that God is trying to get across. There's a wrong thinking that God is trying to deal with the children of Israel. Joshua chapter 24, verse 14. Joshua says, and these are some of his last words, his advice to the children of Israel. He says, now therefore fear Yahweh and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye Yahweh. And if it seem evil unto you to serve Yahweh, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites. He says, make a choice. You're going to serve me, or you're going to serve the gods of the Amorites. Fear Yahweh, or fear the gods of the Amorites, in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. Joshua was telling them, you need to make a choice here. They were supposed to be fearing Yahweh, but at this point in time, they were fearing the gods of the Amorites. Fearing. I think it's useful to take a look at this concept of fear, as it's used really, really well in this chapter in the story of Gideon. So really, there's two types of fear that we have to deal with. The first fear is the feeling of anxiety caused by the presence or nearness of danger. So if you got up this morning really early and you went out for a run, or maybe not that ambitious, maybe you were walking to the bathroom, and you got up and there was a cougar that was right in front of you. That was number one, right? It would terrify you. You would jump right out of your shoes and you would be running or doing something to try to get away. That's fear number one. It's an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous and likely to cause pain. In our story here that we're looking at today, the Midianites are the ones that you would have this type of fear for, because they had 135,000 men in their army. There's also fear number two. And fear number two is the respectful dread or awe whereby one individual recognizes the power and the position of another. So that's fear one and fear two. So fearing the gods of the Amorites, which do you think it would be? So it would be two, because the gods of the Amorites were not an immediate threat, but they did have a respect or an awe at this point in time for the gods of the Amorites. Now, which type of fear are we supposed to have for God? Fear number two, right? We're definitely supposed to have a respectful awe, maybe even dread, right, on some occasions, whereby one individual recognizes the power and the position of another. So when Joshua says, I want you to fear Yahweh, and that's one of his key points as he parts from Israel, he's expecting number two. He's telling them that's what you need to have. This prophet then, if we go back to Joshua, go back to Gideon in Judges chapter 6, the prophet was saying that the Israelites were in a place where they actually thought that the gods of the Amorites had power. That's the place that they had arrived at. They actually thought that the gods of the Amorites were in control over them. They had respect for them and they had awe for them. Well, how could they have gotten to this point? Because this is a really difficult place for God's pattern of saving with the judges to get them out of. But how could they have arrived at a place where they actually had this type of fear for the gods of the Amorites? Well, think about the conditions that they lived in. The average person, if you were in Israel, would look out and you would think that the Amorites were actually strong. It'd be very easy for you to think that the Amorites were actually strong. The Midianites were ruling over you. They were oppressing you. You were living in a cave. They beat you when you had battles with them. They were always victorious. You'd think the gods of the Amorites must actually be stronger than Yahweh is. And that's what many people in Israel actually began to think. Now, think about how that works sometimes, or can work sometimes in our lives, or maybe in people that we thought of that have had so many difficulties come into their life, and they get to a point in their life where they think that God really isn't in control. Because God would never do that to us. God would never do that to me. And they get to a place where they actually think that God is not in control. And that's a very dangerous place to be. And that's where many in Israel were, where they were in a place where they actually didn't think that God was the one that was in control. But God uses trials to adjust our thinking when his word isn't getting it done. And he uses those trials to help us to come back onto the right path. And we need to make sure that we don't misinterpret those trials and think that God really isn't in control. I hope that makes sense. There's a few verses I like in James chapter 1 that I think are worth looking at here, because when a very tragic thing happens in our lives, we can lean in that direction and come to think that really God isn't in control, that there is no God, and our faith can be shaken by that. And that's what was happening in Israel. Let's look at James chapter 1 and verse 2. So that in this case, we've got the believers are in a really difficult position because of the persecutions that they're having, and they're wondering about all these trials that are coming on them in James time. So James chapter 1, verse 2, James says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that she may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing." So let God bring these trials into your life because he is working to change you, to make you into something that he can use. He's doing that for a reason, and it's for your own good. He says, so let that work in you. But sometimes you're going to have trials that are going to come in your life, and you're not going to understand those trials. You're not going to know what those trials are coming for. Sometimes there'll be multiple trials, and you'll begin to think, maybe like Israel did in the time of Gideon, that maybe God isn't in control. He says, no, that's the wrong approach. God is in control. God is directing your life. And what should you do about it? He says in verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, if you don't understand why those trials are coming, ask God. Right? And God will make it clear to you why those trials are coming and what's happening. So that's a little aside I think that's helpful for us, and maybe helps us to relate to what Israel was going through in their difficulties in the times of Gideon. So many in Israel then were thinking that Yahweh was not as powerful as the gods of the Amorites. For them, they had fear number 2 for the gods of the Amorites instead of having fear number 2 for Yahweh. So when God brought the Midianites against them and God oppressed them, you remember from class 3, we said that God allows, even brings difficulties into our lives to help us to see that his ways are better. And after he has shown us this, we must decide who our master will be. Well, for Israel, that was being short-circuited because they actually thought that these trials were coming not from God. They thought the Midianites were not under God's control, but they were actually under the control of the gods of the Amorites. That's the context of Gideon. That's the problem that Israel faces at this point in time. So let's take a look at Judges chapter 6, verse 11. Now we have the angel that shows up. Judges 6:11, it says, "And there came an angel of Yahweh, and he sat under the oak which was in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite. And his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites." So we said fear is a key point in Gideon's life. Fear is something we want to keep an eye on in Gideon's life. Fear? Why is he threshing wheat in the winepress? Because he's afraid of the Midianites in this case, right? You would never do that. You would never thresh grain in a winepress. And yet he's doing that because he's afraid that the Midianites are going to come and attack him. Which fear? 1 or 2? Fear number 1, you got it. So he's got this fear for the present threat of danger coming, the Midianites coming to fight against him. So verse 12 says, "And the angel of Yahweh appeared unto him and said to him, Yahweh is with thee, thou mighty man of valor." He says, Yahweh is with thee. Okay, we get that. And then he calls him a mighty man of valor. Why does he call him a mighty man of valor? You're threshing wheat in a winepress, hiding from the Midianites. You're not a mighty man of valor. And the word mighty there is the word Gibor. It means powerful. By implication, it means a warrior. The man of valor just means a man of force. So here's Gideon, our mighty warrior, and he's hiding in the threshing floor, in the winepress, instead of in the threshing floor, right? He's not where he should be because he's afraid of the Midianites. We don't have to read the story of Gideon because we're familiar with the rest of the story of Gideon. What does Gideon need over and over and over again to get him to get to work and to do the work? He needs signs, right? He keeps asking for signs. Why does he keep asking for signs? He keeps asking for signs because of fear, number 1, because he's afraid, because there is an imminent danger. So that's what we see with Gideon, is he's a guy that's just always afraid of things. And yet somehow God needs someone that understands fear number 2 in order to make these things happen. So he asks for signs, sign after sign. But what does Gideon say about himself? In verse 15, if we go down there, we'll skip a couple of verses just to see this. Gideon says, "O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am least in my father's house." How can I make a difference, he says. I'm nobody, right? And that's probably how most of us feel when we think about the need to bring about changes in the ecclesia. Why me? I'm not the right person to do that. Well, that's exactly how he felt. And he's definitely not a mighty man of valor by what we see here. Verse 14 says, "And Yahweh looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might," so there it is again, "and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee?" So this might, this strength is what he's talking about. He says, you're going to save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. But what's all this confidence that the angel has in him based on? Now you could say, well, the angel knows, God knows the end from the beginning, so that's what it's going to be based on. But I think you'd be missing it. I think we'd be missing the point if we thought that was what it was. There's something in the conversation that Gideon has with the angel that shows where God's confidence is based. So let's go back to verse 12. It says, the angel of Yahweh appeared to him and said, Yahweh is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. Right? So then Gideon responds, and Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if Yahweh be with us, why then is all of this befallen us? And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, did not Yahweh bring us up from Egypt? But now Yahweh hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. What's the key statement that he makes in verse 13 that tells us that he's a mighty man of valor? What tells us that he's the guy for the job when you look at verse 13? He says, Yahweh has delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. Yahweh has done this, right? Isn't that awesome? Just that one statement. That's the statement right there that makes all the difference, because Gideon is different than the rest of the people of Israel, or than many of the people in Israel, because Gideon believes something that other people just don't believe. He knew that the power of the Midianites did not come from the gods of the Amorites, but that it came from Yahweh himself. And this was something that very few people in Israel believed. You know, when we get to the end of the class today, we're going to find that actually the Midianites believe this too. And it's wonderful how this conversion has taken place. So we're not surprised then, I think, when we come down to verse 14, and the angel says, it says, and Yahweh looked upon him and said, go in this thy might. You're the right guy, because you have it right. You understand the concept. And if you can believe that I'm in control, if you believe that I'm in control, and you could convince Israel that I'm in control, we can have a victory over the Midianites. Gideon, you're perfect for the job. And he says, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? That's the whole point. And what does that teach us? What's the point for us? Because you've got to always look at that, right? What's the lesson for us in this? What do we know? We know the same thing, don't we? We know exactly the same thing. We know that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men. We know that he sets up all the rulers of the world. We know that all the world's troubles are under God's control. We know that he's working to prepare the earth for the kingdom. We know that Yahweh's in control of the United States. He's in control of Russia. He's in control of China. He's in control of Canada. He's in control of Australia, just to make sure I got everybody covered here, right? He's in control of everything. We know that. And we're among a very small group of people that know this. Knowing this, then, we should not be afraid of anything. We shouldn't be afraid of anything. Now, for me, that's not the case. All too often, I'm afraid of a lot of things. And a lot of things I worry about, right? The world, I worry about the economy. Are going to people going to still keep buying tires, right? That's one of the things that bothers me. I worry about teaching this class. And Michelle always says to me, God's in control. And that's really annoying, right? She always says that to me. But she's exactly right. That's exactly what it is. God is in control. And we know that God's in control. And yet we have this struggle between these two types of fear, don't we? We know fear number two, and yet fear number one seems to be the greater driver, at least in my life. That fear seems to be the greater driver in my life. Which one is stronger? Fear number two is definitely stronger, isn't it? It just takes longer to build up fear number two. If we realized that God was in control of everything, nothing would be a problem for us at all. If we could just get to that level. Well, Gideon is going to be pushed, I think, to a level where he does amazing things as well. And really, God does them. He's the one that shows Israel the way to go as he goes through this. So verse 16, one other thing we should point out is that fear number two is the antidote to fear number one. We've been alluding to that, but fear number 2 is the antidote to fear number 1. So if you're afraid of things, you should work on fear number 2. And with Gideon, how does he work on fear number 2? We haven't seen it yet, but he asks for signs. So we've just had a whole bunch of signs presented to us this week that should help fear number 2 be a lot better for us, right? The book of Revelation is our book of signs that proves to us that that God is a God that we should respect and have awe for, because we actually believe that he's in control of all things. And if we want to work on fear number 2, that's how we do it. We look at the signs that have been given to us and we study them, and then we look at the world and go, that happened. And that happened. And that happened. Just like God said. And that's exactly what Gideon does, except he does it in real time. All right, so let's take a look then, verse 16. It says, and Yahweh said to him, surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. So Gideon says, whoa, I believe you're in control of all things, but me fighting against the Midianites, all of those guys as one man? Wow, so fear number 2, yes, but fear number 1, more. And he said unto him, verse 17, if now I've found grace in thy sight, if you're going to use me and help me to do your work, he says, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. The New International Version, I think, is good here. It says, give me a sign that it's really you talking to me. Prove to me, God, Yahweh, that this angel is really an angel that's speaking to me, and that he's your angel speaking to me. So, first sign comes up here, right? So Gideon goes out and he prepares what amounts to a burnt offering, I think, which represents a dedication, complete dedication, and for sure a meal offering there, a gift of one's own labors. And he's in effect saying, I'm dedicating myself to this service and my work, my labor to this service, and he's asking God to prove it. And verse 20, and the angel of God said to him, take the flesh and the unleavened cakes and lay them upon this rock, pour out the broth, and he did so. And the angel of Yahweh put forth the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and there rose up fire out of the rock and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. The symbol of God accepting the offering, for sure, God accepting what the offering represented, which is, yes, I accept you as the one, and God providing the sign which proved to him that it was God, it was Yahweh that was in control, that was going to help him. And then we're told the angel of Yahweh departed out of his sight. So Gideon had been given a sign. He'd been given a sign of exactly what he intended to do, and that God was supporting what he was intending to do. And then he's put to work. His first mission comes up. And his first mission is to throw down the altar of Baal, using one of his father's bullocks, to cut down the Asherah pole, to build an altar to Yahweh, and to offer a second bullock on the altar. It would be a great symbol of what we were talking about, the fact that the Amorites weren't really gods, but only God was. Judges 6, verse 27, then Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as Yahweh had said unto him. And so it was, because he feared his father's household. So he's got some fear number 1 going on there. And the men of the city, that he could not do it by day, and he did it by night. The present danger was large in his mind, but he goes forth and does what he was asked to do, and he does it at night. In verse 28, it says, and when the men of the city arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was cast down, the grove was cut down that was by it, the second bullock was offered upon the altar that was built. And they said one to another, who hath done this thing? And when they inquired and asked, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, hath done this thing. And the men of the city said unto Joash, bring out thy son, that he may die, because he hath cast down the altar of Baal, and because he has cut down the grove that was by it. Now, why in the world would those men want to kill Gideon for what he had done? Because they believed that the gods of the Amorites were real. And they believed that if this had happened, what he had done would actually bring the anger of the gods of the Amorites on their city. And so they said, let's kill Gideon. because of what he's done, because they actually believed the wrong thing. But Gideon's father, Joash, believes the right thing. He believes that Yahweh is in control. Look what he says in verse 31. And Joash said unto all the men that stood against him, will ye plead for Baal? Will ye save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death. Let him be put to death, whilst it is yet morning. If he be a god, let him plead. He's not really a god, he says. This is ridiculous. And if he is a god, let him plead. Let him make a case for himself. Because one hath cast down his altar. Yeah, Joash, right? He's saying exactly the right thing. You've got it. And that's probably where Gideon got it from. You could see that he totally had the fear of Yahweh. He completely did. And he says the right thing. And he supports Gideon in what he's done. And Gideon's fear is assuaged somewhat. It goes away. You know, it's often how it happens in an ecclesia. One man steps up, one person steps up, right? And it could be a sister easily. We saw that clearly yesterday. But one person stands up and starts with the work, and then others stand up too. Where was his father before? He obviously agrees with the point, but he wasn't doing anything about it. And Gideon standing up gives his father courage to stand up for it as well. Great example, I think, of how important it is to make that first step. So verse 32, therefore on that day he called him Jerubbaal. Even they change his name and say, let Baal plead, right? Because Baal is nothing. That's the point of it. There is no Baal. Baal is just a piece of wood. Let Baal plead against him because he hath thrown down his altar. So Joash gives him a new name that commemorates this very important point. Verse 33, the response comes. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the children of the east are gathered together, went over and pitched in the valley of Jezreel. Now what type of fear is coming back? Back to one, right? We're back to that. This huge force comes out. Verse 34 says, but the Spirit of Yahweh came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and Abiezer was gathered after him, and he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, who also was gathered after him. And he sent messengers unto Asher and unto Zebulun, unto Naphtali, and they came up to meet them. So the message goes out. It's time to fight. Yahweh is in control. Come and be a part of this. And it goes from one person to a family, to a town, to a country. He's saying, come, brothers and sisters, and let's fight against Canaanite thinking because Yahweh is in control. And they get out there, and they gather together, and they look out, and they face an army of 135,000 men. And Gideon looks, and he's got 32,000. Back to fear number one again, right? There it is again. It's going to play on him. Fear number one is getting stronger and overpowering fear number two. So what does he do? I'm going to need a sign, right? He asks for a sign at this point. Verse 36. Gideon says to God, if thou wilt save Israel by mine hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool in the floor. And if the dew be on the fleece only, and it be dry upon all the earth beside, then shall I know that thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said. You know, I read that verse and I wonder what he's thinking. That night when he went to bed, what was he hoping would happen? Right? If the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, God is with him, and that means what does he have to do? He's got to go out against 135,000. But if the ground is wet and the fleece is wet the next day, what does he have to do? Nothing. He could just run and hide again and escape and go back to where they were. And I bet that thought went through his mind a few times that night. But God makes the point that he's in control and shows him very clearly. Verse 38, it says, and it was so, for he arose early on the morrow and thrust the fleece together and wringed out the dew of the fleece, a bowl of water. But fear one is still there, right? Is that just a coincidence? Is there something that I didn't think about there and that just happened because that's just what happens? Verse 39. So Gideon said unto God, let not thine anger be hot against me, and I'll speak but this once. Let me prove, I pray thee, but this once with the fleece. Let it now be dry upon the fleece, and upon the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, for it was dry upon the fleece only, and there was dew on all the ground. God says, no problem. And boosts fear number 2 for him. And his confidence is increased at that point. You know, we might be a bit smug thinking about Gideon needing all these signs. But if we ever get to thinking that way, just let's look at ourselves and make sure that we aren't in a similar position. Let's make sure that our fear number 2 is strong. So we come to Judges chapter 7, verse 1. It says, then Jerubbaal, who's Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early, and they pitched beside the well of Herod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And you'll never guess what Herod means. Herod means fountain of trembling, because the Israelites were all trembling as they looked down at the 135,000 men. They were vastly outnumbered. And it's only just starting, but they're vastly outnumbered. And not enough of them realized that Yahweh was the one that had the power, and that Yahweh was the one that was in control. And so God decided, okay, I'm going to make that very, very, very clear. And the Lord said, Yahweh said to Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand hath saved me. I don't want them to think that the victory that I'm going to give them was something that they did themselves. That's a very important principle, because pride in ourself and pride in our accomplishments is the opposite of fear number 2. It erodes fear number 2. When we think that it's us that's doing it and it's not God that's in control, we lose that respect for God. Verse 3, it says, now therefore go to, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. So there's fear again. And he says, all right, anybody that's afraid, they don't have to go to the battle. They can go. It says, and there returned of the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. So everybody that was afraid, everybody that had what? Which fear? Fear number 1. Everybody that has fear number 1 leaves, right? That was the group that was afraid, and they leave in this case. And we're left with just the 22,000 people, right? And Yahweh said unto Gideon, the people are yet too many. Bring them down unto the water, and I will try them for thee there. It shall be that of whom I shall say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall go with thee. This shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And of whomsoever I say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. He says, I'm going to try them further. I'm going to divide them some more. So we brought down the people into the water, and Yahweh said to Gideon, everyone that lappeth of the water with his tongue, as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by thyself. Likewise, everyone that boweth down upon his knees to drink. So group number 2. Group number 2 are people that in the battle, or before the battle, as they're getting ready for the battle, these are the people that get down actually on their knees, and they drink of the water as a dog would drink the water. Now, who would ever do that in a battle? Right? He's already taken away from them the people that are afraid. But there's some people that are never afraid, even when they should be afraid. And I'm talking here about fear number one. They're never afraid. They just aren't, they're not sensitive to danger. They don't recognize the fact that there's a great danger there. They will just go no matter what. They look like they might have fear number two in them, and that's overcoming fear number one, but it's just because they really don't recognize what real fear is. It's almost as if, and you might say, they're just not smart enough to recognize the danger that was at hand. And that's this group number two. So they're insensitive to danger, and they bow down on their knees to drink because they just aren't afraid of anything. That's group number two. And the number of them, if we read in verse 6, it says, and the number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300. So there's another group then, and this group drinks. They reach their hand down into the water, and they take the water, and they drink the water out of their hand so that they can remain alert because they are very much aware of the danger, and yet they're still there. They're not among those that went back from the fight. They're still there because they have a very strong fear number two in them. So who are this group here? The group of the 300. They're the ones that had fear and were sensitive to danger. They had fear number two, and they recognized that there was a real problem. They're the group that drank with one hand and stayed standing upright. It's a little bit confusing the way that the King James reads there, because you'll notice at the end of it, it says, but all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink water. That's just talking about the group number two, the group that was sent back because they didn't drink the water the way that God indicated. Hopefully that makes sense. You'll see that we end up then, and the key point is that we end up with a group that has a real fear of Yahweh. They recognize Yahweh is in control, and yet they're very much aware of the danger of the circumstances that they're in. So verse 9, it says, and it came to pass the same night that Yahweh said unto him, arise, get thee down unto the host, for I have delivered it into thine hand. But if you fear to go down, go thou with Phurah thy servant down to the host. So he says, if you're afraid, bring somebody with you. I want you to go down to the host, but if you're afraid, take Phurah. So was he afraid? Yeah, because he takes Phurah with him, right? He had that fear. So he takes him with him, and they go down into the camp, and God's going to give him another sign. Fear number two is going to get another boost. So Judges 7, verse 11, it says, and thou shalt hear what they say, and afterward shalt thine hands be strengthened to go down unto the host. Then went he down with Phurah, his servant, unto the outside of the armed men that were in the host. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the children of the east lay along in the valley like grasshoppers for multitude. Okay, Gideon, how's your fear doing now? You get down there and you look at the camp and you see there are miles of tents. And these are the people you're going to be fighting against tomorrow. There are miles of tents, it says. Well, it says there's a great multitude. And their camels were without number as the sand by the seaside for multitude. It's not helping so much with my fear right now. But while Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow and said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian and came unto a tent and smote it that it fell and overturned it that the tent lay along. Right, and his fellow answers and interprets the dream. Verse 14. His fellow answered and said, this is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Now that's great. That's super good for Gideon to hear that, to hear him say those words. But look what he says next. For into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host. Now the Midianites are the ones that are terrified. The Midianites are the ones that recognize that God is in control. And the Midianites are terrified because they recognize that God is not on their side. That's exactly what Gideon needed to hear. That is exactly what Gideon needed to hear. That's exactly what Israel needed to hear, because that's what they didn't believe. Repeating the last part of verse 14, it says, "This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. For into his hand hath God delivered Midian and the host." Now, what had God said to Gideon in the first place? In verse 14, he said, "Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites." This is back in chapter 6. "Have not I sent thee?" Now Gideon's fear was being increased greatly, and his fear of the present danger was going down. It was almost gone. And it was so when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof, that he worshipped. And he returned unto the host of Israel and said, "Arise, for Yahweh hath delivered into your hand the host of Midian." So that same idea, that same concept of Yahweh being the one that was delivered is given to Gideon in the first place. It's then repeated eventually by the Midianites themselves, recognizing that God was in control. And then Gideon uses that to rouse the people up to go and to fight against the Midianites. The tide has been changed. It's been completely changed. And there still hasn't been one arrow fired. Judges 7, verse 20. "And the three companies blew the trumpets." They come together, they blow the trumpets. We know the story. They break the pitchers, and they held the lamps in their left hands, and the trumpets in their right hands, to blow withal. And they cried, "The sword of Yahweh and of Gideon." And they stood every man in his place round about the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and Yahweh set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled. Could there be any question in anyone's mind that God was in control? Could there be any question? Just 300 men, and these men, the men of Midian, end up killing each other. It says, "And Gideon went up after he chased them." They fled from him, and he chases the Midianites. It says, verse 11, "Gideon went up by the way of them that dwelt in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and smote the host, for the host was secure. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued after them, and took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and discomfited all the host." Discomfited means terrified. He terrified now the host of the Midianites. The tide has completely turned. Brothers and sisters, what an awesome week we've had together. We've seen the incredible wisdom of God and how superior God's wisdom is to anything that the world has to offer. We've seen how foolish it is for us to do what's right in our own eyes. We've seen how important it is to take up the fight against the Canaanites. And we've looked at examples of people that did exactly that, from Genesis all the way into the book of Judges, how people dealt with that, how people worked together, how people relied upon God for that fight. We saw how important it was for us to be like judges, for us not only to uphold the commandments of God, but for us to go out and to save each other, showing each other the same kind of love that God shows for us in that type of deliverance. And we've seen how important it is for us to answer the call when others call us to help, because that call is going to come. There's going to be many opportunities that we have to go out and to fight against the Canaanites. When that call comes, go and fight. You'll be glad that you fought, as everyone that has ever fought against the Canaanites is, because it brings us to a place where we recognize, as we do with Gideon, that God is in control of all things. And God will work in your life like he did in the life of Gideon. He will develop you step by step by step by bringing trials and challenges into your life. And if you always look for the signs of the scriptures to keep your confidence up that God is actually controlling things, you will be able to overcome. And you'll be able to follow the example of the judges in delivering Israel. And of course, we look forward, brothers and sisters, we look forward to the time when the Lord Jesus Christ is the judge. He's the judge of the whole world. We're told in Isaiah that in the kingdom, the system of the judges will be revived. That this system will actually be used by the children of Israel for the government of the world. And we're told that above that system of judges where the mortal Jews are going out and judging, above them will be another system of judges. And that's the system that we hope to be a part of. The system of those judges that the mortal judges rely upon for the difficult cases. Just like in Israel, the judges went to Moses with the difficult cases. So brothers and sisters, we look forward to that time in the kingdom when we can play that role. It's an exciting thought, I think, to keep in front of our minds. And I want to thank everybody for their great attention. It's been a lot of fun this week, and thank everybody that's put together this camp. I know there's a small group, and they do a lot of work in order to put it on, and it is very much appreciated. So thank you very much.